Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Dr. Gary Barker. Dr. Barker is the president, CEO, and co-founder of Equimundo Center for Masculinities and Social Justice, a leading global voice in engaging men and boys in advancing gender equality and positive masculinities for over 3 decades. With a PhD in developmental psychology from Loyola University Chicago, he co-founded the International Men and Gender Equality Survey, the largest survey of men's attitudes and behaviors related to violence, fatherhood, and gender equality. He's also the co-founder of Mencare, a global fatherhood campaign working in more than 50 countries, and has advised the UN, World Bank, and national governments on strategies to engage men as allies in gender equality. Gary, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Wes.
I'm excited to chat. So, you've spent decades researching and working with men globally through your International Men and Gender Equality Survey that I mentioned. What patterns have you observed in how men across different cultures relate to masculinity? And maybe what surprised you most about the generational shifts you're seeing in young men today?
Yeah. There's a lot of data points in there. We could talk hours. We've written long reports, presented it to governments, et cetera. The bottom line is it matters what we learn at younger ages about ideas about manhood. Do we see around us in our household men who represent more caring versions of manhood, where there's more equality practiced in the household? Or do we see men around us who live rigid, inequitable, sometimes violent versions of manhood? Kind of our simplest big headlines is that where men observe caring manhood growing up, they're more likely to live that and pay it forward. Not all that surprising, perhaps, that, we learned that with other men around us, but also with, important role of women in that, where boys also see their mothers empowered in the world, working outside the home, having voice. They're also more likely to believe in healthy ideas about manhood, and to believe that gender equality is women's rights, and to follow those patterns over their life cycle. And where men and boys witness violence by other men and experience it, we're more likely to repeat it. So kind of there's an intergenerational transmission of care and caring manhood, and there's unfortunately a intergenerational transmission of harm and violence as well. Obviously, no man is a data point, and we make different meanings from what we learn and see growing up. There's lots of men who witness violence, experience it, don't go on to use it. There's some men who maybe had dads and other men around them who show caring versions of manhood who cause harm later on. So it's not this automatic equation. We see two other big trends that are hanging there, which is around the world, more conservative countries or more progressive countries, young women, the generation of young women compared to their mothers, are demanding and believe they have the right to full equality in the world. This generation of younger women are more likely to believe, I get to be in the world as much as any man does. On the other hand, we're seeing young men stuck in many countries or even going backwards. And we've been measuring this in the US since 2016, and looked at kind of similar set of questions, similar sample, 2016, 2023, 2027. Young men in the US are going backwards on views around a more caring, connected, equitable view of what it means to be men. Now, on the one hand, that can feel to men like we're accusing you of that you're backwards, you're harm-inducing and all kind of stuff. Our question is always, well, why? What's behind that? Why do young men feel less invested in a version of manhood that says women and girls are equal? Violence may not be the way that I get what I want in life, that I'm not in charge when it comes to sexual relations. It's negotiation and consent. To think that, that showing feelings or asking for help is a sign of weakness. These things cause harm to men ourselves, in addition to they're associated with harm we may carry out against others. So, the dark part of this is that young men are buying into a version of manhood that causes us harm ourselves. And so we're trying to step in with deep empathy about that, to say we need to bring men on this journey, and we need men to see our stake in this better connected, caring version of manhood.
Thanks for laying the groundwork there. That is fascinating. I'm curious because you said you started tracking this in 2016. I think most people would generally see the trend of healthy masculinity be heading in a positive direction throughout history. So I'm wondering, is it more that like the overall trend is positive and trending upward and we're seeing like a dip in recent years, or would you say no, we've had a misunderstanding of the progression of manhood, and actually this is a more accurate understanding of it?
Yeah, I mean, and keep in mind, I'm putting lots of, that's a big trend line. That doesn't show just how much variation there is as well. There's a lot of young men who support gender equality. And if we ask the questions in different ways, do you think women should have, fair and equal shot in employment? It hits 90% there. So there's a lot of things about fairness that I think most men in the world would agree with that. It's more about these views about manhood, right? A view that I don't show weakness, I don't show I need help, I don't show vulnerability, I'm always in charge. Those views seem to be gaining traction slightly. Some countries it's flat. So we may see more support for men with kind of women in spaces in the world where they should be, but at the same time adhering to this idea of, men take no prisoners. They're always in charge. Violence is an okay way to get what you believe in. So it's not there's not one single line that holds that all together. At the same time, we've got a group there are younger men, maybe 1 in 5, depending on where we look, who are doing something interesting as advocates for a better world for others that has to do with healthier ideas of manhood. So they've gone to a pride parade. They support actively abortion rights for women in their country or their setting. They support some other piece of advocacy that is for the rights and well-being of others. So, I don't want to do some blanket statement that, Gen Zs or millennials are, falling behind and, we want to slam a whole generation. That should not be the story. It's varied, but we should be worried about how many young men, and we see this, we know that the online lives and this thing we call the manosphere, we know that politicians, it's not by chance our 2016 survey was carried out the year Trump won the first time. We know how, and in other parts of the world as well, we know how politicians have used men's confusion and economic anxiety to bring votes to their side and say, we'll tear it all down and make it better for you. They don't ever deliver on that, by the way. So it's important to say that, but they are swaying young men that direction. So what do we need to do about that? So yeah, it's more complicated than simply that big trend line that I was reporting on.
Thanks for clearing that up and kind of setting things in proper perspective. And speaking of the stats that you're using to inform your understanding of the decline, though, of course, varied as you mentioned, are we seeing those across cultures as far as the poor academic performance, the lack of showing up in jobs, single parent households, incarceration rates, substance abuse? Are those also across the board, or would you say those are more westernized or American specific?
Again, Asians, but some global trends, right? There's data from the World Bank and UNESCO. We've been an advisor on those studies that in 100 countries around the world, the world has 200 plus countries, 100 countries around the world that represent about 60% of the world's population. Boys are falling behind in school on aggregate compared to girls. Falling behind means they're less likely to be on the reading level they should be for their age. They're less likely to be on the grade level they should by their age, less likely to complete secondary school. Primary, we've pretty much achieved equality in the world. A few countries, rural parts of a few countries in Africa, rural parts of a few places in South Asia where we've not achieved that, and then some countries like Afghanistan that are woefully going backwards under the Taliban. Globally, 60% of the world's population, boys are faring worse in school when it comes to secondary completion and particularly kind of the middle school to the secondary school years. And those trends in university that we see in the US, where it's now about 60+% are young women, around 40%, slightly less for young men. That's happening in some countries in the world as well. So there is something going on there we've got to think about. It particularly affects lower income boys and young men, but not only. Then the other ones you mentioned, if we look at homicide statistics, if we look at life expectancy, if we look at incarceration rates, overwhelmingly men. Economic troubles of men. Low income countries, it's been a chronic challenge. If you look at the lower income parts of the world, where if men continue to see their role as providers, kind of the main function that they fulfill as men, which men tell us in many countries, 90+% of men tell us they think that's their main identity. There's a constant sense that of economic anxiety because of not being able to make enough income for their families, particularly for low income men around the world. The precarity that we see, what I think we see as a difference happening in the world these days, is an economic anxiety or precarity felt by a lot of middle income and lower middle income men. And again, huge differences across the globe with that. But if that's been sort of chronically low income men's problems, the middle income and lower middle income men also feeling this sense of economic insecurity. Also important to say, we've not achieved at the global level in the US or anywhere, any country has not achieved full economic equality for women. The global gap is about 20% less, just a little bit less than that, in terms of men's income compared to women. Women's labor force participation still less than men anywhere we look. Men's is stagnating while women's, it's been some variations. The overall trend is kind of increasing, but so there's more than one story in all of these. We've not achieved equality, and a lot of men feel economically anxious.
I think that's good to hear. As I've been doing the show, we've been exploring these dualistic understandings, a wrong view of that men have, which is if we allow for the well-being or, in your words earlier, advocacy of others to have fair and equal rights and opportunity, then that means we're losing something when
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be seen like that. It's a way where we reallocate, redistribute, and re-understand these things where everyone actually comes away better. And it sounds like that's what you're saying in your stats. And I'm curious, you've been using these words, it seems, if I'm understanding correctly, care versus violence as a core understanding or expression of manhood. What's your sense, whether it's psychological or just through your studies, on why you think violence and care are main ways men see themselves as men?
I'm a developmental psychologist, as you noted at the beginnings, thinking about how we key part of what we understand of early childhood development and how that frames how we become, more capable humans connecting in the world in more complex ways is, do we come into the world feeling that those around us protect us, put our care as central to who they are, and in fact, do they put our care in front of their own well-being? And do they, as they help us understand the things that, as we become more complex humans and need help to, keep ourselves out of harm's way, do they do that in ways that are based in care, or are they based in domination and violence against us? So we clearly know that, witnessing and experiencing violence early on is traumatic for boys and for girls. Whether you witness it by your father, another man against your mother, whether you witness it against siblings, whether you yourself experience it in the home, or school, peer group, community, a war zone around you, high rates of urban violence. We as, young children are absorbing, is the world a safe place? Or am I stepping into an idea that the world is hostile and others around me are hostile and I've got to figure out how I defend myself? Do I perceive there's sanctions or not against others who use violence? And so much of that violence is associated with manhood. Do we show we're tough? Do we get recognized as men? Do we hold up views of men as violent from the toys we play with, the video games we play, the political leaders around us, the roles given certain men with weapons in societies? Do we see that every single day and make a meaning of it that says that's what men should be doing? So I think there's a combination of trauma that boys and men internalize and often don't get support for, as well as a learning around the social norms, we might call it, the social learning theory part that says we incorporate ways that we see human interactions happening around us. We repeat them, we see how they work, we try them on for fit, and we figure out if they work for us. And if the violent ones work and we get praised for that, we're likely to keep living them. And then the trauma part becomes a deeper piece that folks like you need to work on, right? We need psychotherapy. We need group processes. We need an understanding of how we help men move beyond trauma, which for men we know often remains beyond a wall of silence. And often men's depression related to trauma will get turned into aggression or violence. And so I think we often have trouble acknowledging that's not to make excuses for men's violence. It is to understand where it comes from so that we can do the appropriate interventions. Whether that's then it becomes the question of, so what do men who have carried out violence, what kind of support do they need, while we also hold them accountable for harm? So that was maybe a complex way of saying how we learn and internalize violence. And I think why we've been saying care is so much of our work around violence prevention with men has been saying we want to see violence-free lives. We want to end violence. And while that's really important, it doesn't provide a North Star for what men need to do. We're trying to tell you something not to do. How much are we talking to you about what you should do? And so care has felt to us like the simplest, most obvious verb to fill in there, right? What is the opposite of violence? I think as a developmental psychologist, I would simplify it to be care. It is care for others, creating protective spaces for others, protecting others when they need it, modeling my concern and my connection to you. And we're summing that up in the verb to care. So it seems to resonate as well, and it kind of makes sense. It's a big verb in the English language. It means lots of things. To care for an elderly parent, to care for a pet, to care for a child, to care for my buddy, to practice self-care, which I also think is interesting for men, to care about the environment, to care about a better world, to care about my community. It does a lot of lifting, so we're gonna keep with care as the as what we want for men.
I like that. Keep with care. And I appreciate you mentioning the trauma piece. That's my understanding of it too. It reminds me of the ACE studies and how many people that correlate that with so many of the issues that men have. And, I also appreciate the care framework in light of that, which is many men find themselves here. And this is why I'm interviewing experts and wise people such as yourself, which is many men have been told what not to do or what's bad. And then they're looking around wondering, so what do I do? How can I be a man? And I think the care is such a beautiful and accurate and effective framework that basically says, because you didn't either actually get the care you needed, or your experience was a sense of lack of care subjectively, either way, that trauma internalized the narrative that created a sense of not feeling safe, worthy enough, valuable enough, that led to you being more at risk to using violence or being exposed to violence as an act of power, safety, security, that and some people want to be violent for the sake of violence. Like you said, we need to call a spade, and we need to see the inner child beneath it all, the inner boy in this case, that says, actually, most of these people act out of that because they simply don't know that they're cared for.
Yeah. And perhaps weren't, right? Or weren't with the fullness that they deserve to feel like, I was kept safe from harm. And I internalized an idea that I've got to, engage in the world in a way that also treats others with the care that I received. I think our what we talk about, the importance of an early holding environment and an early attachment of children, to know that the kind of simplest conclusion around early childhood development is that every child needs at least one adult who is absolutely crazy about you. And crazy about you, is kind of a simple way to say would put your interest over theirs and would do everything they could to make you feel safe, secure, and loved. And the internalization of that seems so important to who we become as adults. And we have a challenge with how we raise boys. There's also what may have happened as you were growing up, but there's also this big story we tell about manhood in the bigger world, which is tough it up, don't cry, don't seek help, and a notion that, well, no, he's got to get away from, if he's too close to his mom or other caregivers, or a dad that's perhaps, or another male caregiver who's perhaps too soft on him, but how much the world says, don't be soft on boys. The language we use, the emotional language we're more likely to use with girls than we are with boys as boys grow up, sends boys this message that don't show you're too, needy, or don't show you're too fragile, because you will lose points. It's almost like we're in a video game that takes away points if we act vulnerable, when in fact all humans are, these soft flesh creatures who are figuring out, how to get by in a world and need help from others. And that seeking of care from others is in fact what we are biologically evolved to do. There's a rich science of the evolution of humans that shows how much we're deeply wired to give care and how deeply wired we are to seek care. It is, if you look at science now and say, what separates humans from other animals? Well, it's not just the opposable thumb. And we know there's some really smart birds that use tools. What it does seem to be is just this, among other things, is the complexity of how wired we are at multiple levels of our brain and our endocrine system to give care, and our bodies changing to give care, and our bodies are wired as young children to seek care. And I think trying to step into that as that's the piece that's often taken away from boys and men as a this should be your human birthright to call it that. This is the species you evolved to be born into. How do we help you get back that sense that I was cared for and I can care for others as the kind of the place where we become our best humans?
That's well said. And it brings up a question in me that I'm wondering, do you feel that most men don't internalize that care as essential both in receiving and giving because they've misinterpreted the understanding of their role as protector? I know you mentioned provider being a very deeply entrenched identity that many men feel like they need to ascribe to. I'm curious if you have found the same about protector and how that plays out.
I think that is a great sense that men feel, and women. So a sense that I must protect those that are in my care circle, and even caring for my community and going broad. I think there's a lot of men who that protector sense that most societies kind of think men should be doing is fabulous. The question is how you do it, right? And what does that mean? And if you think, well, only I can do that, instead of saying, well, actually women seem to be quite good at it too, if you in lots and lots and lots of different ways. So it's kind of how am I a protector, right? How do you step into that space? And I also don't think the provider role, it's how do we help men expand the roles? Not that we need to take that away from them. That's a sense of care as well. I mean, the number of men that we'll talk to who say, I'm migrating from work and left my family behind. I had to. That's my care for my family. I took a job that's across the country, or I had to cross a border to get where I thought there was an economic opportunity. We, sometimes frame that as abandonment, but often a family and a man himself will frame that as that's the care I'm providing for my family. And we as a family made a deep kind of thought about this. And so I think all of these to me are, I don't want to take any of these away from men. I want to add to their bigger repertoire of ways they speak, a language of care for others. And I think the other part is that lots of boys do experience carrying men around them growing up, but it doesn't get the kind of attention that perhaps the exaggerated protector version gets. And when we feel the world is kind of collapsing on us, or it's on fire around us, or economically it feels like it's completely uncertain, I think too often men step into an anxious protector role rather than an it's okay protector role. And we kind of know the difference between a man who's like, let's go blast all the other ones back to, the Stone Age, versus an it's going to be okay. Let's think this through. Let's look at the best in them as we bring out the best in us. That to me is a protector role too. Men who speak a language around of peace whenever possible, whether that's on your street or in your home or in the bigger world. I think we've got to take that branding back and say peacemakers are protectors too, right?
Well said. I couldn't agree more. And I resonate with that sense of healthy certainty. I think where it becomes too much is where you try to overstep it and assume that the protector role needs to be for things that fall outside your scope of responsibility, that you're masking as this need to look out for. And in fact, ironically, it's keeping you from looking after the very things that you need to most.
Yeah.
And speaking of this sense of maintaining the integrity of the role, which I really appreciate, but just enhancing and changing it, your work focuses on what you call intergenerational patterns of harm, which I find really curious, into patterns of care, as you mentioned, empathy, accountability. Many men struggle with the vulnerability and emotional expression, which I imagine is also culturally across the board. What have you found to be the most effective approaches for helping men break those cycles and embrace the more caring forms of masculinity that you talked about?
Yeah. We do a lot of group discussions with young men and adult men. I think we're seeing in the US and lots of places men having a hunger to be able to talk about these issues, to break kind of the wall of silence that says, we don't seek help, we don't talk about these things. These versions of manhood I learned from my parents, my dad, my grandfather. How dare you question them? I think increasingly we're finding young men and adult men saying, I want to talk about this. One of the things that we will do in group education settings with young men, and we've done this in 40-ish countries with this approach, is it's kind of an emotional literacy activity where we'll list 6 or 7 kind of most common emotions and ask young men first to think about it individually and then talk in small groups. How is it for you to express those? And just about anywhere across settings, the easiest thing that men say, the easiest one for me to express is anger. And the hardest ones to express, sadness and fear, right? The ones that show my vulnerability versus the step into anger. And then to say, well, how is that going for us? And to let in a group setting to talk about what are ways we can learn to express fear, sadness, anxiety that don't turn into anger. And some of it is kind of practicing just how do we say those words without feeling like I'm going to be smashed by by my male peers for being less than a man. And to talk through that as well. Like, why is this so hard? Where did we learn this? And how can we try to step into those conversations, being able to express those? So I think one is finding that, helping men have an emotion, a deeper emotional literacy, to call it that. We also need men who look like us modeling that. So those can be celebrities maybe, but also men around us, teachers, religious leaders we look up to, other men in the household, to step into that. We also do father training in about 30 countries, using men's first journey as when they're expecting a child with their partner to do, because a lot of men at that moment are quite vulnerable around, ooh, this big change is about to happen in my life. We can engage them often through health systems, a little more complex in the US because our health services are so spread out. But it's essentially a bit of birth preparation plus thinking about my emotional readiness to be a parent, which doesn't generally get offered. And so giving men a chance to say, I kind of often describe men in our first journey into parenthood is a bit like, deer stuck in the headlights of like, oh, now what? And we don't really feel, again, a safety to talk about that. We can do the now what around, okay, I need to know how to help my partner during childbirth. I need to build the crib. I need to paint the wall. I need to, the kind of human nesting stuff that we do, but also just to say, I really am not sure what happens next in all kinds of levels. And so stepping into that moment and allowing men to say, what is the parent I want to be? Those activities we start with a pretty simple, psychotherapeutic informed approach. We ask you to write a letter to your father or your male caregiver. What did you appreciate? Not one that you're going to mail or put in the mail. We don't send letters much anymore, but you're not going to put online or post, but just one to say, what did I appreciate about you? And what are some things I would do different? So to begin to be conscious about what we know as, as a psychotherapist, I know as a developmental psychologist, is how much we internalize the care models that we had around us. So getting, just helping us become aware. Obviously, one activity is not enough to do it, but to sort of plant that of, there are things I learned that I want to repeat, things I learned that I don't want to repeat, and maybe there's some new skills that I've got to come up with that I need to work on that are outside my repertoire, but I need somebody who might know them who could share those with me.
I think that's brilliant with the exercise of writing the letter. I am curious what you think about this. So my father passed when I was 11, so I didn't quite get the full understanding of what I appreciated. I didn't. But nonetheless, I'm thinking I should do this for myself to write it out. Because I think also in the writing, you're touching on a core role, and this is going to be a less than ideal name for it, but I call it the coach that a lot of men have, which is this need to, learn lessons and extract them and then teach them and repeat them, whether asked for or not in many cases. And I think the letter allows that format in a disarming manner to almost say, hey, we're not asking you to right away to share like what feelings are coming up around it or your need to be vulnerable about sharing your experience about those, but just writing it out in a safe and private manner. It reminds me similarly of what they do in recovery as well. When you're making amends, many of the letters that you write will never be sent. But the point is that you find reconciliation with yourself first and that you process it, have an understanding of that. I'm curious, within that exercise, what you would suggest to a guy that maybe doesn't know where to start about extracting those lessons, what he may be able to think about or focus on that may help him have a first step in processing that. If, let's say, he's never touched it and then he says, okay, I listen to this podcast, great idea. Where do I start?
Yeah. One is that the dating myself here, but that Beatles song, I get by with a little help from my friends, right? Of don't try to do it alone. Like first and foremost, just, don't operate this equipment by yourself. I mean, obviously you can. There's a lot that we can find in our own mental abilities and strength and thinking through things, but really we do our best work, and our best self-improvement requires the other selves, right? I think, and particularly young men, I think I see a lot today of the kind of, well, I'm just going to work on myself, and kind of like, yeah, you can't really do it by yourself though. Work on yourself with others, right? And the kind of, you said the coach word, right? But even finding among the peer group, finding among, if it's young fathers, can you find some other guys who are kind of in a similar situation, or maybe, a buddy, who's got a 6-year-old and you really like, oh, they're doing something I really like, and open up a conversation about it. Like how, tell me about it. Can we, I'm curious, how you get through some tough moments. Just, breach that conversation with, yeah, I'm a bit concerned. Like, how did you step into it? So yeah, it's let's make the world so that men feel asking for that help, acknowledging that you can share something that will help me in my journey, that I cannot find it just alone. There's a huge amount of, I'm thrilled with how much this online world now has. You can find a huge number of groups. You can find a Reddit thread on lots of great stuff there. Do that. Look at those, the good ones that tell you, kind of your better self, not try to tell you to go burn it all down. But also just we got to talk to others and make that safe, that men can talk to others. We'll also include in those conversations a lot, even if, there will be a fair number of men in those conversations who will talk about an emotionally distant, physically absent, perhaps a harmful father and a father figure. But to say, were there, and thinking about now, are there other men you look up to who give you a sense of the kind of care that you've needed? And I don't think it's also that men do this with men. Women are a huge part of this, mothers and sisters and aunts and partners and female friends and colleagues. So it's also not just men have to go in our own men's groups, right? Some men will tell me my male role model was my mom, was an aunt or a grandmother, right? Who, because they were providers and protectors and carers at the same time. So I think it's also, saying, what about others? It doesn't have to be a man. Tell me about how, who you felt cared for you. What are those things that you want to take forward? I think it does help if I can see another man doing this, but I don't think it's essential. A lot of amazing male caregivers who say, it was my mom, my auntie, my grandmother who taught me how to do this. Couples that are off on their own and didn't have contact with their parents for a long time, of men telling me in the context of a heterosexual relationship, it was with my wife or partner or girlfriend that I feel like I learned how to do this and do it together. So kind of, where do you have support now? How can you bring that conversation up with them and try to do less of that on your own? Please
Yeah.
talk about it. Yeah.
Mm. And I'm glad that you mentioned the need to look to men around you as role models. I think that's a myth we believed in society probably since the internet, but really since entertainment has taken the forefront, whether it's an athlete or an actor. Men tend to hyperfixate on getting to know these people that they have no relationship with, that represent a general skill that, for all intents and purposes, they don't express themselves. No one's trying to be a better football player by watching a NFL game, kind of thing. And you're bringing it down to a local understanding, which I know Scott Galloway's work has talked about. He calls it garbage time with his kids. It's the day-to-day interaction that you have with other men in very normal settings. And I had another guest who had an interesting take on rite of passages in the West actually being started in agrarian culture, where you would work alongside your dad all day. You would hear him talk to other men and you'd ask him questions then. And now, because we're so hyper individualized and isolated, we don't have a lot of those connecting points that are so important. And I'm thinking, I'm first time father. I have a 14-month-old. And I think your work would have been, if I would have found it sooner, it would have been so helpful, because I do agree so many guys are looking around in the dark, wondering, what do I do? Mothers seem to have a natural bond with other moms of talking, how is it for you? And asking about different experiences. They also start to experience it obviously biologically sooner. So it's harder for a man to wrap his head around what's it going to be like stepping into this role as a father. But I will say I did try to ask other guy friends. A lot of my friends are fathers, and it's very affirming that you're saying that is a mode of how we basically model what's appropriate,
Yeah.
what's not, what's normal, what's not. So I really appreciate you saying all that.
Mine was a journey that, parenthood as well. My wife and I moved to Chicago where I was doing my PhD in developmental psychology, Loyola, that you mentioned. And she was a main breadwinner. She's a psychotherapist and works in public health. She was the bigger breadwinner while I had a research grant. US continues to be the only Western democracy that has no nationally guaranteed paid leave for mothers or fathers, right? We are still woefully behind on that. Brazil, where she is from and where we lived for many years, has 5 months paid maternity leave, fully paid, no questions asked, guaranteed under the National Social Insurance Program. So she's like, you've brought me to this backwards country that has no paid leave. I've got 12 weeks of kind of disability leave. She's like, what kind of silly country calls parenthood, pregnancy, a disability? Even the framing we do with it, right? And so it's kind of, all right, we're neither of us is near our families. We're in a city that we've got some friends. She worked in a clinic, so had kind of a network of women providers, pediatricians, it's nurses, et cetera, who were supporting in the pregnancy and the stepping into those first 12 weeks. And then I was part-time stay-at-home dad after she went back to work and went, oh my God, now what? And all the men I know who are fathers, et cetera, they're working full-time someplace. Any play groups that exist, and this is still kind of the common thing, are mostly mothers led. You're kind of a weird figure if you're the dad going to one of those play groups as kind of a, who are you? What are you doing here? To the taking, my daughter to the pediatrician and the pediatrician saying, well, tell the mom. And you're like, I'm right here. I know I look panicked and I, probably look like, help this man. He looks lost. Sure. But give me instructions. I'll probably figure it out. But yeah, it was this kind of, we assume that you're not very competent. So kind of an act of desperation for me was finding kind of 5 other guys who either just had children or another friend who was expecting a child and said, guys, can we once a Saturday, every other Saturday, can we just sort of chat, chill, talk, maybe with babies, maybe without, whichever makes the most sense. And just have a space to say, what do you do? How do you think about this? We had a Lamaze, birth preparation class, which is great, but it was about the birth. And it was kind of, all right, after that, good luck. What to do with all the rest? So just, the importance of men having that space to share our confusion, see other guys, talk, feel okay about it. While also, for me, it was all those conversations with my partner around how do we do this together? We're sharing skills. It's not a competition here to see, who changes the most diapers and who does it what way. But how do we find a way that we've got a groove that we're in we're doing this together. Um, and yeah, it's an amazing unsupported journey for so many couples stepping into this, right? It's just like, you'll figure it out. There's enough books, enough videos. You'll get the professional help you need. You're like, nah, it's a, it deserves so much more support for moms and dads and the others around us as well. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. And I appreciate that you shared that story about how you created a community of fathers. And still to this day, I think, gathering men, of what I'm finding in interviewing other men and trying to follow the research is really the key to start to change. And like you said, there is such a difference between getting the learning support versus the experiential, the emotional
Yeah.
support. And
Yeah.
having that space just to say, man, I lost my cool, or, I've been too selfish, or, I missed this cue where my wife was trying to tell me this, or, having those touch points with other guys, first of all, just to normalize it. I think it's easy to have a lot of shame around it when you're not good at it and you're wondering if you're doing it right, to realize there is no guidebook. But to your point, that doesn't mean there shouldn't be guidance. And re-implementing that, I think, so crucial. And speaking of which, I'm curious if you can speak to Mencare, which is your global fatherhood campaign you work on, promoting men as caregivers. There's often this resistance from men who felt like uh, this sense of caregiver from their father wasn't modeled growing up, because there's this resistance and a worry about losing their masculine identity when they step into fatherhood. Who am I if I'm not, if I'm not in my new role as a man? So I'm just curious, how do you help men understand that caregiving actually strengthens rather than diminishes their sense of manhood?
We created the campaign starting in 2011, kind of looking globally, what's up on gender equality, a lot of, that I mentioned that before, of women's participation in the workforce. So a lot of things that need to happen, including paid leave, to make that, to end the gap and to make it easier for women to have children, be the world, be in the world the way they want to. So much of it is about who does the care work and how much we value it or don't. And we said, so one is on gender equality, we need men to be part of this. We need equal amount of paid leave for men. And we've got to get beyond an idea that only women need leave. Men need that too. And particularly if we want to send a message early on that workplaces and society values men being caregivers, we need to do as much as women that we offer paid leave voluntarily from a business, even better when it's made part of a state or a national law. So one is just kind of the policy framework we need. The other is that I mentioned violence at the part. We know that where men receive more caring paternal care, they are less likely to use violence later on against a female partner. So we've been talking, we have not been able to bring down global rates of men's use of violence against women in the context of their relationships. It's about 1 in 3 men around the world will use that form of violence, physical violence, against a female partner. Sitting in plain sight in front of us is one of the ways to break that, which is teaching and encouraging and supporting men's caregiving. So, kind of seeing it as it's the antidote that we've all needed to talk about how we end those cycles of violence. The son who doesn't see that violence is also healthier, better off, feels better in the world than if he witnessed his dad or another man use violence. So there's a violence piece to it. And then there's the happiness and well-being for men. And often I'll start the order the other way with, let's start with the happiness and well-being of men. Men who report closer relationships to our children, biologically or not, or other people that we care for, we live longer, fewer mental health problems, less likely to abuse substances, less likely to think about suicide, better intimate lives overall when we report that we've got closer caregiving relationships with others. So this is, if you want to say to the solutions to lots of the mental health problems we're talking about, is allowing men, encouraging men to what we'll often frame it as to exercise your care muscles. Practice the awareness of my own emotional needs, to kind of put on my own mask and figure out how I put on the mask of others. Not my mask is the only one that matters, but I've got to think about my own emotional vulnerability, my own ability to acknowledge my need for connection to others, and then I step into how do I help support, care for others around me. So it felt to us like kind of as we've been calling men out for harm, for the lack of equality for women, we weren't sharing with men all the amazing benefits that we get when we become more caring humans. And that, care for biological children, but far beyond that. So that's kind of the big pitch of what we try to do with the Mencare campaign. Exchanging ideas, material, storytelling, policy advocacy, reports that we do, kind of becoming a place where men can see they're organizing for something that's good for them, that's good for their families, good for their children, good for others they care for, and not being shy about the benefits it brings for men. Because I think we've often tried to frame it. You mentioned earlier that it's a zero-sum game, right? To say no. In fact, this is one where we all win, and it becomes a really obvious one. Where and where we can also help our women's rights partners see, look, we are not in talking about this. We're not taking away attention from what's happening with women and girls. This, in fact, adds to it and brings benefits for all of us.
Yeah, so well said. And it reminds me of what you said earlier about giving men an affirmative or value based North Star or reference point in order to live out of, to show it's not just that we're asking you to change for the sake of change. There is an innate benefit and so many things that come with doing that. And I wanted to touch on briefly what you said. I really appreciated it earlier about most men see self development through an individual based status. And my sense of it is that if you do that outside developing the community in which you're a part of through that, that's what causes this really unhealthy godlike status that many men think that they deserve
Yeah.
or step into, the tyrant or the dictator, and making sure that you are, of course, progressing yourself as an individual, but not giving into that hyper westernized notion that it is all about me and how far I can go. But as you're saying, how can I be generous? How can I be loving? And also, how can I subject myself and my development to the community? I mean, this is one of the brilliancies of marriage, which is it's a constant, if it's healthy, mirror and reflection and accountability to say, you might think you're right, and sometimes you might be right, but oftentimes, how wrong are we? And how often do we exercise that ability to admit we're wrong in a way that actually allows us to do it right? And it seems like what you're saying is a man's ability to be present as a father, see the value and how it benefits everyone else, but ultimately how it's been benefiting him and his development, which is counterintuitive, right? Because you think, well, if I just look out for me, and this is a big thing I hear against the case
Yeah.
against having kids, right? Well, I don't want them to take away from me. I want to kind of progress my career and all these things. And everyone has their reasons, and I would never judge anyone. But now being a father, I can say, oh my gosh, as much as it has cost me, to everyone's point that doesn't want kids, I can say the benefit that it's given me and the expansion of who I am as a man has become way more generous and loving and kind and patient, all the things, the value you were talking about, because I actually chose to subject myself to community by expanding community through new life.
Yeah, I get very worried by the kind of individualism that's so wrapped up in fill in the blank, right? Dating apps, right? Where you're kind of I'm judging and, rating, is this the right relationship for me, instead of the imperfection that all relationships will be, the messiness that caring for others represents, whether I'm caring for my partner or caring for a child or somebody else in my household, like the inherent kind of give and take, the when can I express my interest, when do I have to put the interest of the other in front of me, that messy reciprocity of relationships, I think, is where the best human development happens. And I do worry when I hear lots of young men and young women saying this, of like, well, I'm young men in particular worried about being called out, the 2/3 who think their reputation can be destroyed with a single phrase from a woman that they did X or Y. And so therefore I'm just not going to be in relationships. Young women, or all of us, kind of in the dating app world, of like, I'm looking for this kind of this perfection out there. And I think the same plays with children as well, that we're trying to create this, do I have every perfect condition for my child? And I think that is that's a statement on this world right now that feels so uncertain, where it does feel the kinds of support we need to be the messy, confused humans that we are, and to feel okay about it, right? That we've kind of lost the sense of safety of, it's going to be okay. Step into this, it's going to be okay. You will, in you find yourself in others, you don't find yourself by yourself. And I'm not sure if that's how we can get that message across, that whether it's committing to a relationship that there's a chance you will have your heart broken and you'll feel horrible, but it's weird to tell you, but you will be a better human after it. And I try to convince others to, that I trust me on this, and to put yourself out there with a care relationship, biological child or other, adoptive, foster, somebody that you mentor for, somebody else in your household. The number of us that are rejecting our parents because they weren't perfect. It's like, folks, we've got to find a way. Yes, there are toxic relationships, and some probably do deserve to be broken off from, but find ways that we can accept and fight to be in those spaces. You have to know when. There are obviously toxic relationships that have to be walked away from, but I think we've got to help this generation of younger people feel like that that messiness is where we find our humanity, and the holding up for the perfection, we're going to be stuck and alone. And I've rarely heard anybody at the end of their life say, oh, I so regret that I had those children or had that relationship, or that I had that deep bond with this family member over there. It's more the ones I didn't have. And that's hard to think about when you're 20ish, but in a life course, if you don't throw yourself out there for the messiness of human relationships, it's a long, lonely ride from my perspective.
That's beautifully said. I resonated with every word. And what comes to mind is the fatal myth that men and most young people think they can be self-reliant, or that they have the ability to cut people off or cut people out. When we know historically before, for better and for worse, but certainly in this case for better, you couldn't untether yourself from community. You had to stick it out. And this is a core principle of marriage, right? Is you actually go into the conflict in a safe and secure manner that, like you're saying, makes you better on the other side. And we could spend a whole other episode talking about the relationship side of things. But for today, I'm curious if you can end with giving us some wisdom from your TED Talk, actually, where you talk about a through line of violence and masculinity. And given the current cultural tensions around discussions of masculinity, we're finding a lot of defensiveness and heightened politicized expressions of it in conversation. And really, it's taking away the pure conversation that I think we need to be having. So for a guy that is realizing he wants to be a healthy, mature male, wants to have these conversations. Maybe he's either connected or in relationship with, community with men, or in general, yeah, just this sense of apprehension to masculinity. How can we have these conversations in a way that don't make men feel attacked, but instead invite them into the healthier expressions of masculine
Yeah.
identity?
I don't know if there's an easy formula on that one. I mean, I think one is breaking the silence around it. That I do step into every one of those conversations, even with men that may seem on the outside very hostile. That there's a caring human on the inside there, or a human with the potential to care. And I think just the framing of it, of those of us who want to start the conversation of, I'm not here to fix you. I'm here to find the caring human that I know that you are part of a species, that's what we do best. That can I affirm that your superpower is your ability to be and care with others, and the bravery to find that, rather than thinking your bravery is about the harm that I can cause to others or the fear that I can instill in others. That find the bravery to be that caring human that is where you feel your best and the people around you feel you as your best. So, I think it's about, again, I think that probably the key secret to that one is going into that conversation, not that I'm going to fix you as a man. It's not my job here to fix you. And that I'm also not, there are times we've got to call out, to use that expression, to call you out for harm. But that the through line that I have to be is calling you in to be this caring human that I know you are. I know you have that skill. It's in there somewhere. We're going to find it. We're going to find it together. You know it. You can find it, right? That kind of, so it's affirmative, not a denying of, but it's an affirmative conversation.
Yeah, what a beautiful way to end. Is that really struck me. I'm not here to fix you. I'm here to find you, to find the potentiality of the man you were always meant to be, which
Yeah.
is so much more than the man you're allowing yourself to
Yeah.
be.
I think
And
that's
what
it.
does that look like
Yeah.
to step into it?
Yeah, I think that's it. The kind of the man that you're allowed to be. That's a very thoughtful way. Yeah, a lovely way to frame it.
Yes, thank you. And speaking of lovely ways to frame it, it's just been such a joy talking to you today. And again, I know we just touched the tip of the iceberg of your depth and wisdom, so I might have to selfishly have you back for a round two, but do appreciate your time and curious
Sure.
where people can find you and what you're up to.
Yeah, well, go to our website. Lots of stories, materials. Sign up for a newsletter. We got new approaches, partners, EQUIMUNDO.org. You can find stuff on the Mencare campaign, stuff for work with boys, storytelling that we do, short films, lots of stuff on, and links to other organizations who do this too.
Okay, good. We'll put all that in the show notes. And thank you again, Gary, for your time. And guys, until next time.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Wes.